Welcome to the tutorial video on serving static sites with Layer0. In this video, I'll cover a demonstration of a static React application and how we can leverage Layer0 to serve and cache the pages. If you're just getting started with Layer0, visit our documentation at docs.layer0.co for instructions on how to set up your local environment. So let's start with the basic React site that uses a client-side router for page navigation. This is currently being served from the default React server. So the next step we want to accomplish is serving this from Layer0. First, let's build a production version of our React site so we have all the necessary assets bundled and ready to be served. Then, we need to initialize the project for Layer0. We can do this by using the CLI by running Layer0 init. With the project initialized, let's open up the sources in our IDE. When we initialized the project for Layer0, two new files were created, Layer0 config.js and routes.js. The routes file will contain definitions for the different routes we want Layer0 to match and how they should be handled. Let's start by modifying the fallback route, which, by its name, is a route handler that Layer0 router falls back to if it cannot find any other matching routes. We want to modify this handler to serve our static index.html file that was generated to the build directory after we ran npm run build. The index file contains all the content to load our React site. With that modified, let's start the Layer0 dev server and reload the application. After reloading, we're presented with a blank page, so I'll expand the dev tools to inspect the responses. Going through the list of requests, we can see everyone is responding with the source of index.html since our router will serve that file for every request as defined in the fallback. So going back to the router, let's create a new route that matches a wildcard path and serves that requested file from the build directory. This also includes static assets such as JavaScript and CSS files. Now we can go back and refresh the page and observe the app is functioning as expected. Looking through the resources, we see that our different responses are now correctly being served from the build directory, and clicking through the links transitions the pages as expected. But what happens if I try to refresh and make a request to the About page? We get a 404 because this route is a client-side route that is not handled by the Layer0 router. But Layer0 is trying to serve that file from the build directory and it does not exist. To fix this, we need to also define the known client-side routes into our Layer0 router and ensure they also respond with the index.html file. We can easily handle this by defining a handler that always serves the index. Then, we individually define our known routes that Layer0 should match. This includes routes for the About, Home, and Messages pages. We can also update our fallback handler to use the same function since the behavior is the same. And now going back to the browser, I refresh and see that Layer0 correctly served the index file, and our client-side code detects the path and renders the corresponding page component. In order to get the best performance out of the site, we should also configure browser and edge caching of our responses. The content of this example site does not change between builds, so it is optimal to store assets like CSS and JavaScript in the browser cache and serve them from the edge cache. Our other routes, such as the About, Home, and Messages pages, aren't static assets to store in the browser, but we can also cache their responses at the edge for faster delivery. Let's define a handler that matches our static assets. We'll use this later to define the cache handler. At the top, we define a few configurations that set how long the cache will live for. Because the content doesn't change, we can cache them far into the future. We'll define one specific for the edge and another for the browser and the edge. With the configurations defined, we can go through our different route handlers, reference the cache function, and set the appropriate cache preferences for each route. With everything set, let's take one final look at the responses in the browser. For the initial response, we see the x0 cache control header, which defines the time to live at the edge. If we look at the static assets, we have both the standard cache control header for browser caching, as well as the x0 cache control header for caching at the edge. This wraps up the tutorial on serving static sites with Layer0. In addition to this React example, We also have a static Vue.js and a Backbone.js examples within our guides. For additional details and examples, visit our static site guide at docs.layer0.co.